To hold Arrakis, the Duke said, one is faced with decisions that may cost one his self-respect. He pointed out the window to the Atreides' green and black banner hanging limply from a staff at the edge of the landing field. That honourable banner could come to mean many evil things. This is what Duke later says to his son Paul in the first book Dune, preparing him for the troubles ahead on Arrakis, and if only he knew what would eventually come of the Atreides dynasty. As I was making my previous video on Leto II's Golden Path, I very briefly mentioned the jihad from Dune Messiah and the chaos that Paul Atreides' reign had wrought in Arrakis. Anyway, I thought it would be interesting maybe to revisit Paul as a ruler, the inevitability of the jihad. Why was it inevitable, was it?
Also the impact of it and how it eventually came to an end.
Spoiler alert, obviously, but anyway, onto the video. The Atreides men are a burdened lot. In Dune, Duke Leto, a well-respected leader, seemingly a good man, with a warm character, was already very wary and tired early on, and he has several conversations with his son Paul, where it's clear that he's preparing him as heir, but there's more to it. It's as though the Duke might have known that he didn't have it in him to do what needed to be done to keep stewardship of Arrakis, or, even though as far as we know he had no powers of prescience, he somehow knew that his death was imminent.
As for Paul, did he really stand a chance of truly making his own choices and being his own man? He bemoans this a lot in the books, the fact that his path was in large part determined for him before he was born. We meet him as a kind of lonely 15-year-old with no friends or companions of his own age. He has his mother and the other Bene Gesserit with their expectations of him as the Kwisatz Haderach.
He's resentful of being a pawn in their plan, and of course he has what sometimes feels like the curse of prescience. Then, when the family arrives on Arrakeen, he had people on the streets calling out to him. They questioned whether he was their Muad'Dib or the prophesied Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world. His father had advised him in Dune to capitalize on this. Power and fear, he said, the tools of statecraft. I must order new emphasis on guerrilla training for you. That film clip there, they call you Mahdi, Lisan al-Gaib. As a last resort, you might capitalize on that. And Paul does. In talking to Liet Kynes after the Sardaukar and the Harkonnens have taken back Arrakis, he implies that he might be their prophesied savior. Remember, in the books, Liet Kynes is a man. Presently, Paul said, you have a legend of the Lisan al-Gaib here, the voice from the outer world, the one who will lead the Fremen to paradise. Your men have superstition, Kynes said. Perhaps, Paul agreed, yet perhaps not. Superstitions sometimes have strange roots and stranger branchings. In the scene, he is a newly minted duke and he's trying to establish legitimacy. It's already kind of known who Paul is, but over the course of the book, the whispers and the suspicions become accepted truth among the Fremen. And Paul notices the change in them as a result of this. In that instant, Paul saw how Stilgar had transformed from the Fremen Naib to a creature of the Lisan al-Gaib, a receptacle for awe and obedience. It was a lessening of the man, and Paul felt the ghost wind of the jihad in it. I have seen a friend become a worshipper, he thought. In a rush of loneliness, Paul glanced around the room, noting how proper and on review his guards had become in his presence. He sensed the subtle, prideful competition among them, each hoping for notice from Muad'Dib. This isn't the first mention of jihad. In one of the earlier scenes, while the family is still on Caladan, the Reverend Mother makes a reference to the Butlerian Jihad, a war waged in a quest to end domination of the thinking machines. Paul is plagued by thoughts and visions of the path that he has to take as a leader fairly early on, because he knows that he will be left with no choice but to choose the path ending up in jihad. Out in the desert with his mother, when he reveals that he knows the Baron is her father, he thinks of this path. The other path held long patches of grey obscurity, except for peaks of violence. He had seen a warrior religion there, a fire spreading across the universe with the Atreides' green and black banner waving at the head of fanatic legions drunk on spice liquor. Gurney Halleck and a few others of his father's men, a pitiful few, were among them, all marked by the hawk symbol from the shrine of his father's skull. Surely I cannot choose that way, he thought. But he saw again in his mind's eye the shrine of his father's skull and the violence with the green and black banner waving in its midst. There are two main paths, and if you're wondering what the first path is, Paul says that this path, which entails confronting his grandfather, the Baron, absolutely sickened him. We just have to take his word for it that he had no choice but to take the path that ends in jihad. Every time Paul has these visions of the coming jihad, he becomes determined to avoid it at all costs, but he eventually starts to see the inevitability of it, how futile any effort to change it would be. He thinks of this as he's about to ascend the throne. He had thought to oppose the jihad within himself, but the jihad would be. His legions legions would rage out from Arrakis even without him. They needed only the legend he already had become. He had shown them the way, given them mastery over the guild, which must have spice to exist.
So yes, not only would path number 1 lead to a much worse outcome, but what Paul has now set in motion, not even he has the power to stop. It is debatable, to me at least, whether he even really did try. But the power of this jihad movement is pointed out by Scytale as well. You can't stop a mental epidemic. It leaps from person to person across parsecs. It's overwhelmingly contagious. It strikes at the unprotected side in the place where we lodge the fragments of other such plagues. Who can stop such a thing? Muad'Dib hasn't the antidote. The thing has roots in chaos. Can orders reach there?
It's difficult to pinpoint the moment where Paul explicitly calls for a jihad.
But there is a scene at the end of Dune where the Reverend Mother interprets Paul's words to mean that there will be one.
And when she warns him against letting loose the religiously fanatic Fremen across the universe, he silences her. So Arrakis becomes a Fremen empire, and in Dune Messiah we learn of a 12-year-long jihad which had the purpose of bringing as many parts of the universe under Muad'Dib's rule, and also to spread the Muad'Dib gospel, even though, as we'll see, Paul is really skeptical about this, his own so-called religion. His jihad missions were carried out by a cabal called the Kizarate, intent on making a martyr out of Paul, and obviously forcibly spreading the religion of Muad'Dib. We're introduced to a character named Korba, who is at the head of this Kizarate group, and we see him sitting at Paul's side during an Imperial Council meeting. And in one scene, Paul, who is otherwise occupied, dispatches Korba to lead prayers in his place with the pilgrims.
So even though Korba ends up being a traitor, and Paul hates this relationship, the association with Korba and the Kizarate, Korba is a highly placed official in the Emperor's so-called government.
Paul also knows the impact of his jihad, as he says so himself. At a conservative estimate, I've killed 61 billion, sterilized 90 planets, completely demoralized 500 others. I've wiped out followers of 40 religions. Korba tries to defend their mission by saying that the jihad
only resulted in the death of the non-believers and
brought light to 10,000 worlds. But Paul disagrees. He says he's brought them into darkness. We'll be 100 generations recovering from Muad'Dib's jihad. I find it hard to imagine that anyone will ever surpass this. Heavy is the head, Paul.
He sometimes strikes me as some kind of reluctant, benevolent dictator type. I'm still not completely convinced that he was absolutely powerless against this movement, but he does have the powers of prescience, so he's privy to more than we are. And the jihad does eventually run out of steam towards the end anyway.
Privately, he is tormented, but he has that same fatalism that his father Duke later displayed when he unwittingly predicted what would happen to the Atreides banner and name. Paul worries about the legacy of the Atreides dynasty, and he expresses his wish to end the jihad, to separate himself from the Kizarate, but he sees no way out. Even if I died now, my name would still lead them. He shudders at the thought of the Atreides name tied to what he calls religious butchery. He sensed the future looking back at him out of dynasties not even dreamed. He felt his being cast out, crying, unchained from the rings of fate. Only his name continued. I was chosen, he said. Perhaps at birth, certainly before I had much say in it, I was chosen. Towards the end of the first book, we already see the growing devotion that the Fremen have towards Paul. These were an oppressed people. This was used as fuel to further motivate the jihad outside of the religious fanaticism. Paul's own followers' convictions sometimes confused Paul. As for the thousands who came to Arrakis on their pilgrimages,
see, Arrakis had become something of a holy land.
He didn't understand the purpose of it, but they did seem to get some spiritual enlightenment from it.
Obviously, Paul can't rule forever, so in Dune Messiah, the Guild and the Bene Gesserit start to conspire to find a way to assassinate Paul, to end his monopoly of melange, and also to put an end to this idea that he is a godlike figure. They're looking to assassinate him, but there's always the risk that they might turn him into a martyr.
In Messiah, as the conspiracy against Paul grows, Scytale visits a veteran of the jihad named Farrak.
If you remember, Scytale is a face dancer, and he's also involved in the Bene Gesserit and Guild plan to bring down Paul. Back to Farrak, he longs for the days of living in a proper sietch
and having sandworms transport them to the desert. So now, the veterans live in a little village with housing built especially for them, and it's clear that Farrak doesn't care for it.
The fact that this once jihad fighter is now open to an audience with Scytale to provide intel on the layout of Paul's imperial keep shows us just how disillusioned he has become, and he's not the only one. It's not hard to see why the Fremen would join the jihad movement. After being oppressed for so long, their resources plundered, Muad'Dib brought with him the prospect of freedom and wealth. Not all of the Fremen were caught up in the religious fervour, some were just happy to have an improvement in their personal circumstances. Frog tells Scytale that most of the Fremen didn't think much of Paul being made into this god figure. The Fremen think of the jihad the way I thought of it, most of them. It is a source of strange experiences, adventure, wealth. He sadly points to his home that cost an amount that he could have only previously dreamed of. Still, it's bittersweet for him because he misses the old way of life. Do you know why I enlisted in the jihad? The old eyes stared hard at Scytale. I heard there was a thing called a sea. It is very hard to believe in a sea when you have lived only here among our dunes. We have no seas. Men of Dune have never known a sea. We had our wind traps. We collected water for the greater change Liet-Kynes promised us. This great change Muad'Dib is bringing with a wave of his hand. I could imagine a Kanat, water flowing across the land in a canal. From this my mind could picture a river, but a sea? He speaks to Scytale of his and other men's awe of the sea, and he describes the feeling of being immersed in it. This in itself was kind of like a religious experience. And while it was the idea of the sea that inspired him to join the jihad, it was the sea that ended up also healing him from the jihad. So everything comes to a head in Messiah. There's this conspiracy against Paul. Morale amongst the veterans is rather low. Water sellers and others have lost their way of life, and Paul knows that they hate him for this. Corba's betrayal doesn't help matters in the movement. Paul is tormented and kind of checked out. The end is near. He's also determined to destroy this Muad'Dib figure, and in the end, a blind Paul adopts the Fremen custom, well, he is Fremen, so it is his custom, of going out into the desert to be devoured by Shai Hulud, only we know that that's not quite the end of his story. In Children of Dune, we're in Leto II's other memory when we learn that Paul had considered going to Jacurutu in order to destroy Muad'Dib, and they do speak of Paul taking the Golden Path, as this would bring an end to the chaotic aftermath of his jihad, but ultimately this burden falls to Leto II.